My name is Kenji Takahashi. In August 1945, I was 22 years old and living with my mother near the center of Hiroshima, in a small wooden house not far from the Ai Bridge. I worked as a clerk for the city's communication office. Life was difficult, but we believed the war was finally turning. Food was scarce, and the air raid sirens had become part of our routine, but Hiroshima had been spared. That morning, August 6th, began like any other. The cicadas screamed from the trees, and the air was already thick with heat. My mother was boiling rice, a rare treat, and I was preparing to leave for work. At around 7:30, the radio announced that a small group of American bombers had been sighted over the southern coast. Then, silence. The alert was lifted. Everyone went about their day again. By 8 o'clock, the streets were alive, children walking to school, workers on bicycles, women chatting outside shops. I remember the light, clean, bright, almost beautiful. Then, just after 8:15, I saw it. A single aircraft flying high above the city. It glimmered silver in the sun. Someone beside me said, "Only one plane. Maybe reconnaissance." I looked up, squinting, and in that moment, the world turned white. It was not a flash like lightning. It was everything: sky, air, earth, erupting into one endless light. I felt my body thrown backward. The sound came after, an impossible roar that shook my bones. When I opened my eyes, I was on the ground. My clothes were torn, my ears ringing, the world silent except for the faint hiss of fire. I could not understand what had happened. I thought maybe a fuel depot had exploded. I tried to stand, but my legs shook. The house where my mother had been cooking was gone, not collapsed, not burning, gone. As if erased, only the wooden frame remained, already smoldering. I shouted her name, but the air swallowed my voice. Then I saw the city. Hiroshima was no longer there. Where streets and shops had stood, there was only dust and flame. Buildings leaned like broken teeth, black smoke curling upward into a strange, rising cloud. People wandered like ghosts, burned, bleeding, eyes wide with shock. I remember one woman clutching her child, both covered in ash. She kept whispering, "Water please, water," though her lips were too dry to speak. I stumbled forward through the ruins, calling for my mother. Every breath tasted of metal and smoke. The sunlight dimmed as the great cloud rose above us, a pillar of gray and orange, blooming higher and higher. I had lived my entire life in that city. In one instant, it had become something unrecognizable, silent except for the crackle of fire and the cries of the dying. That was the moment I understood. This was no ordinary bomb. Something had happened that no one could explain, and I was still alive inside it. When I finally found my voice again, I began calling out for anyone who could hear me. No one answered. The streets I knew so well were gone, replaced by a desert of burning wood, brick, and twisted wire. The air shimmered from the heat. I tried to reach where my mother had been. Each step felt heavier. The ground was covered with fragments of tiles and glass, hot enough to burn through my sandals. My hands shook as I pulled aside pieces of our house, but there was nothing beneath them, only ash. A neighbor, old Mrs. Sato, stumbled toward me. Her kimono had turned to rags, her skin dark and cracked. She didn't seem to recognize me. She only said, the sun fell on us." Then she collapsed. I gave her the last of our water, but she was already fading. I wanted to help her, to carry her somewhere safe, but where could I go? The hospital, the riverbank, anywhere that wasn't on fire. I moved toward the Oda River, stepping over debris and bodies. Some people were alive, moving slowly, quietly, as if in a dream. Their hair was burned away, their faces swollen. One man carried what looked like a doll, but when I looked closer, it was his daughter. He kept whispering that she was just sleeping. The river was full, not with boats, but with people. Dozens of them stood in the water, their clothes smoking, their skin red and peeling. They were trying to cool the burns. Some sank quietly and didn't rise again. I cupped water in my hands and drank. It tasted of ash, but it was all I could find. Around mid-morning, strange black rain began to fall. The drops were thick, warm, and oily. I didn't know it then, but it was radioactive soot, the ashes of our city. People lifted their faces to it, desperate for water, not realizing the poison it carried. By noon, the fires had joined together into one great storm. The wind howled through the ruins, pulling flames from house to house. I lay near the riverbank, covering my face with a wet cloth, waiting for the heat to pass. From time to time, I thought I heard my mother's voice, but it was only the crackle of fire. I remember thinking that maybe everyone was gone, that maybe I was the last person alive in Hiroshima. When the sky finally darkened again, it was not from nightfall but from the smoke. The city had turned to shadow. That evening, I saw a line of soldiers moving through the ruins. Men from the nearby military hospital, dazed and burned, helping each other walk. One of them looked at me and said, "Get to Hiroshima Hill. There are doctors there." I nodded and followed, though my legs trembled with every step. As we climbed the hill, I looked back at what had once been my home. The center of the city was still burning, glowing red against the black sky. Above it rose that terrible cloud, vast and silent, shaped like a giant tree of smoke. I had seen fire before. I had seen bombs, but nothing like this. It felt as if the world itself had opened and swallowed us whole. By the time I reached Hiroshima Hill, the sun had disappeared behind a haze of smoke. The air still burned my lungs, but the fires below had begun to die. What remained of Hiroshima glowed faintly, like the coals of a dying forge. Hundreds of people had gathered on the hillside, burned soldiers, mothers carrying children, old men clutching what little they had saved. No one spoke loudly. The air was too heavy for words. Only the sounds of pain filled the night, soft moans, quiet sobs, the rustle of bodies shifting on the ground. A few doctors and nurses were there, but they had almost nothing, no medicine, no bandages, no water except what they collected from the rain. They tore strips from their own clothes to bind wounds. Some tried to comfort the dying, others just stared into the distance, their faces blank. I helped where I could, moving the injured, bringing small bits of water, covering the dead with sheets of paper or straw mats. The bodies were everywhere. I tried not to look at their faces, but sometimes I recognized them, a shopkeeper, a boy from school, my neighbor's wife. Each one reminded me that my mother was still missing. The smell was unbearable. Burned wood, burned flesh, and something else, something metallic that clung to the air. The ground itself seemed poisoned. My head spun, and I could taste blood when I coughed. Later that night, the fires across the city began to fade, leaving behind a darkness thicker than anything I had ever seen. No electric lights, no lanterns, only the faint red glow from the ruins. Above us, the great clouds still hung in the sky and moving, illuminated from below by the smoldering city. People lay side by side in silence. Some called out for family, who would never answer. Others asked for water until their voices disappeared. I remember one boy, maybe 10 years old, who kept asking, "Is this the end of the world?" No one could tell him otherwise. Round midnight, I finally sat down near the base of a pine tree. My hands were blistered, my clothes black with soot. The ground was warm, and every breath still hurt. But exhaustion overcame fear. I closed my eyes, unsure if I would wake again. In the distance, I thought I heard church bells, faint, echoing through the smoke. Later, I realized it was only the sound of metal cooling and collapsing. When morning came, Hiroshima was quiet. The fires had gone out. The city was gone. All that remained was the smell of ashes and the faint sound of the river, flowing through what had once been home. When I opened my eyes, the world was gray. The fires had finally died, and the smoke drifted slowly toward the sea. The air was cool, but the silence felt heavier than the heat of the day before. I stood up on trembling legs and looked down at Hiroshima. It no longer looked like a city, more like a flat, endless plain of ashes. The few remaining buildings stood like skeletons, black and hollow. The rivers wound through the ruins like dark veins. From the hillside, I could see small groups of people moving below, not walking, but crawling. They looked like shadows, bent and slow, their clothes in tatters. Every few steps, one would fall and not rise again. I walked down to help, but there was little I could do. Some people's eyes were swollen shut, their skin hanging in strips. Others were too weak to speak. They just reached out their hands for water. I gave what I could, a few mouthfuls from a cracked canteen I'd found. One old man gripped my wrist and whispered, "Why did they do this to us?" I had no answer. By midday, soldiers from the nearby towns began to arrive. Their faces showed disbelief. They had heard the city was bombed, but they couldn't understand what they were seeing. One of them said it looked as if a giant hand had pressed Hiroshima flat. They began setting up first aid stations, but the supplies were gone within an hour. There were too many wounded, tens of thousands, and too few doctors left alive. The heat made the bodies swell and blacken. Many of the dead still sat where they had fallen, as if frozen mid-motion. That afternoon, a rumor spread. The bomb had been a new kind of weapon. One single device dropped from the sky. Some said it released invisible fire, others said it burned the air itself. No one truly knew. I found a piece of mirror near the ruins of a house and looked at my reflection. My face was covered in dust and blood, but I was alive. My hair had fallen out in clumps during the night. I didn't yet understand why. Near the riverbank, I finally found what was left of our street. The houses were gone, but I recognized the path where my mother's garden had been. The flowers were burned to nothing. I searched through the ashes until I found her comb, blackened but still whole. I held it in my hands for a long time. For the first time since the blast, I cried. Not loudly, the tears came slowly, silently, falling into the dust. That evening, as the sun set behind the ruins, the sky turned red again. I thought of the people still trapped beneath the rubble, of the ones who had called for help and received none. The army told us to leave the city, to find safety in the countryside. But I couldn't go. Not yet. Hiroshima was my home, even now, even like this. As darkness fell, I made a promise to myself. If I lived, I would tell what I saw. Because no one would believe it otherwise. In the days that followed, time lost all meaning. Morning and night blended together under the haze that hung above the city. The smell of smoke and decay never left the air. I stayed near Hiroshima Hill, helping where I could. We built makeshift shelters from burned wood and sheets of metal. People came up from the ruins every day, some walking, some carried, their bodies covered in burns, their eyes vacant. The doctors who arrived from nearby towns were exhausted. They treated the wounded with little more than cloth and boiled water. One young nurse, her face bandaged, told me quietly that she had lost her whole family but refused to stop working. If I keep my hands busy, she said, I don't have to think. At night, we listened for the sound of planes, but none came. There was no bombing raid, no warning siren, only the hum of insects in the blackened trees. After 3 days, people began to die without visible wounds. They had survived the blast, the fire, even the smoke, yet suddenly they collapsed. Bleeding from their gums, their hair falling out, their skin covered in purple spots. No one understood why. We didn't know the word radiation. We only called it the sickness. I watched friends weaken in hours. One boy, barely 16, had helped carry water since the first day. On the 4th morning, he tried to stand, then fell forward and did not move again. By then, soldiers had begun burning the bodies to stop disease. The air filled with the bitter smoke that settled over everything. We tried to count the dead, but there were too many. Some said more than 100,000. Others said numbers didn't matter anymore. I searched again for my mother, though I knew there was no hope. Each time I passed the ruins of our home, I whispered her name, not expecting an answer, but unable to stop. One evening, a group of American planes flew high above the city. They did not drop bombs. They only circled once and disappeared into the clouds. Some people cursed them, others stared silently. I remember thinking how strange it was that a single plane had changed the course of all our lives. As the days passed, the ashes of Hiroshima turned white under the sun. The rivers ran black with debris. The survivors spoke less and less, their voices thin and distant. I began to write notes in the margins of an old notebook I'd found, names, places, memories. I didn't know if anyone would ever read them, but it felt important to remember, even as everything around us faded. Every night I wondered, why was I still alive? There was no answer, only the wind moving through the ruins. We were the witnesses now, the ones left to remember what had been done, and what had been lost. By the end of August, the city began to stir again, not with life as before, but with quiet movement. People returned to search for family, to rebuild, or simply to understand what had happened. The smell of death still lingered, but plants had begun to grow through the ashes, tiny green shoots pushing up where everything else had burned. I had survived, though I didn't understand why. My hair was thin, my body weak. The doctor said the sickness might return at any time. Many of the friends I had helped during those first days were gone. The nurse who had bandaged the wounded beside me, she, too, fell ill and never woke. When the first foreign doctors and photographers entered the city, they looked around in disbelief. Some cried openly. One of them asked me, through an interpreter, what it had felt like when the bomb fell. I told him there were no words for it, that it was as if the world itself had ended for a moment. They called it an atomic bomb. We didn't understand the science, but we understood the meaning. A weapon that burned an entire city to dust in a single instant. In September, the rains came again. The blackened ruins turned to mud. The rivers overflowed, washing away the ashes, the bones, the small things we had buried. I remember standing on the riverbank, holding my mother's comb, and realizing that it was all I had left of her. Years later, I would learn that the bomb had killed over 140,000 people by the end of 1945. Some died instantly, others over weeks or months. Many had no graves. I rebuilt my life slowly. I left Hiroshima for a time, then returned, because I could not leave her behind. The Peace Memorial was built on the ruins of the city center. Each August 6th, I go there to light a candle and watch it float down the river. People often ask me why I tell my story. Some say the past should be forgotten, that it was war, and war is cruel. But I speak because forgetting would mean it could happen again. When I close my eyes, I still see that morning, the silver plane gliding above, the flash that swallowed the world, the silence that followed. I do not hate the men who dropped it. I only hope no one, anywhere, will ever see such a light again. Hiroshima still lives. The rivers still flow. The cicadas still sing in summer. But beneath the sound of life, I can still hear the echo of that day, the moment when the sun fell, and the world changed forever.